They said no black man could survive what happened in Crimson Valley that night. They said the massacre would be the end of him. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that sometimes the worst moment of your life becomes the beginning of your legend. This is the story of Isaiah, Iron Blackwood, the cowboy who rode into hell and came back to make devils pay. And before we ride into this tale of blood, bullets, and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't follow the script Hollywood wrote. We tell the truth about the Wild West, the stories they tried to bury, the legends they tried to erase. Now let's ride. The year was 1873, and the town of Crimson Valley sat like a forgotten promise in the Oklahoma Territory, a place where the law was whatever the man with the fastest gun said it was. The town got its name from the red clay that stained everything. The buildings, the streets, even the water in the wells had a reddish tint that made it look like the earth itself was bleeding. Most folks said it was just the iron in the soil, but after what happened there, people started saying the land knew what was coming, that it had been preparing for the blood that would soak into it. Isaiah Blackwood rode into Crimson Valley on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing but a horse named Justice, a Winchester rifle, $43 in his pocket, and a past he was trying to outrun. Isaiah had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, faced down rustlers, survived stampedes, crossed rivers that wanted to drown him, and deserts that wanted to bake him alive. He'd earned the nickname Iron because a trail boss once saw him take a kick from a horse that should have killed him, watched him stand back up, dust himself off, and finish the job. The man said Isaiah must be made of iron, and the name stuck. But Isaiah wasn't looking for a reputation when he rode into Crimson Valley. He was looking for peace, for a place where he could work honest, save money, maybe buy a piece of land and build something that was his. He'd heard there was a ranch outside town looking for experienced hands, the kind of work he knew better than anything. What he didn't know was that Crimson Valley belonged to a man named Silas Crow, and Silas Crow didn't believe black men deserved peace. Silas Crow owned the Crimson Ranch, the biggest spread in 3 territories, with over 50,000 acres and cattle that numbered in the thousands. He also owned the bank, the general store, the saloon, and most of the people in town through debt or fear. Crow was a Confederate officer during the war, a colonel who'd led raids that became infamous for their brutality, and when the South lost, he headed west with his men and built an empire. He brought his worldview with him, a worldview that said there was a natural order to things, and black folks belonged at the bottom of it. Crow tolerated black cowboys on his ranch as long as they knew their place, worked twice as hard for half the pay, ate separately, slept in different quarters, and never forgot that they were there by his permission, which could be revoked at any moment for any reason or no reason at all.
Isaiah knew all this before he took the job. He dealt with men like Crow before, men who looked at him and saw property instead of a person, men who smiled while plotting your destruction. But Isaiah was good at his work, exceptional even, and he figured if he kept his head down, did his job better than anyone else, and didn't cause trouble, he could make it work. For 3 months, that strategy paid off. Isaiah worked harder than any 2 men combined, was first up in the morning and last to bed at night, handled horses that others were afraid to approach, found cattle in terrain others said was impossible to search. The other ranch hands, black and white alike, started to respect him, started to see him as someone to learn from. And that was the beginning of his problem, because Silas Crow didn't want his black workers to have respect, didn't want them to have pride, didn't want them to believe they could be exceptional at anything. The trouble started when Crow's son, a 22-year-old waste of space named Clayton, tried to break a horse that had thrown 3 experienced riders. Clayton was drunk, angry and determined to prove something to his father, who was watching from the porch with other ranch owners who'd come to talk business. The horse was a beautiful black stallion that had been caught wild, and it had no intention of letting Clayton or anyone else climb on its back. Clayton got thrown hard, landed on his back in the dirt while the other ranch owners laughed, and his face turned the color of the valley's clay. He pulled his pistol, aimed it at the horse's head, ready to kill something because his ego was bruised. Isaiah stepped in without thinking, put himself between Clayton and the horse, spoke in that calm voice he used with spooked animals, and said that killing a horse worth $300 because you couldn't ride it was poor business. He said he could gentle the horse, make it rideable within a week if Crow wanted to give him the chance.
The words were reasonable. The tone was respectful, but Clayton saw it as a challenge, as a black man telling him he couldn't do something, and in front of witnesses no less. Clayton turned the gun toward Isaiah, and for a moment, everyone thought they were about to see a murder. But Silas Crow called out from the porch, told Clayton to put the gun away, told Isaiah to gentle the horse and prove his words. It wasn't mercy. Crow saw an opportunity to teach a lesson. If Isaiah succeeded, Crow could work him harder, justify paying him less by saying he was just doing what he was supposed to do. If Isaiah failed, Crow could punish him for overstepping, for embarrassing his son. It was a setup either way. But Isaiah didn't see the trap. He just saw a chance to save a horse's life and prove his worth. And if you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and hit that like button, because what happens next is going to show you exactly why they tried to erase men like Isaiah from history. Isaiah spent the next week working with that stallion, and it was like watching magic happen. He didn't break the horse, didn't try to dominate it or show it who was boss. He gentled it, spoke to it, spent hours just standing near it, letting it get used to his presence, his smell, his voice. He'd bring it food, brush its coat, check its hooves, treat it like a partner instead of property. By the third day, the horse would come when Isaiah called. By the fifth day, it let him saddle it. By the seventh day, Isaiah rode that stallion around the corral like they'd been partners for years, and every hand on the ranch stopped to watch. The horse moved like water, responded to the slightest touch, and you could see that it trusted Isaiah completely. When he was done, Isaiah dismounted and handed the reins to Silas Crow, said the horse was ready for whoever wanted to ride it.
Crow took the reins, studied Isaiah with those cold gray eyes that had watched towns burn during the war, and said that was fine work. He said Isaiah had earned a bonus, $5 whole extra that month, and dismissed him. But Clayton was watching from the barn, and the look on his face told everyone that this wasn't over, that Isaiah had made an enemy, that the worst thing you could do to a man like Clayton was make him look small. For the next few weeks, Clayton made Isaiah's life hell in small ways. He'd assign him the worst jobs, the ones that were dangerous or pointless or both. He'd check Isaiah's work and find fault even when there was none. He'd make comments in front of the other hands, calling Isaiah uppity, saying he thought he was better than his station, that he needed to remember what he was. Isaiah took it all without complaint, because complaining to a crow about a crow was suicide, and he still believed that if he just did good work and avoided trouble, things would settle down. Then came the incident with Sarah Miller. Sarah was a white woman, 19 years old, daughter of the man who owned the general store in town. She was engaged to Clayton Crow, though everyone knew it was a business arrangement more than a love match. The Millers got protection and status from the connection, and Crow got access to the store's profits and a pretty wife for his son who desperately needed any kind of achievement he could point to. Sarah was kind, though, genuinely kind in a way that was rare in Crimson Valley. She'd speak to the black ranch hands like they were human beings, would sometimes sneak extra supplies to the families who worked the ranch. Once helped nurse a sick child back to health when the doctor refused to come because the family couldn't pay. She was the kind of person who believed in goodness even when surrounded by evil, and that was dangerous to men like Crow, because kindness is revolutionary when cruelty is the law.
One Saturday, Sarah rode out to the ranch to bring Clayton his lunch because he'd forgotten it that morning. She arrived to find the ranch in chaos because a bull had broken through a fence and was terrorizing the area near the main house, charging at anything that moved. The hands were trying to rope it, but the bull was massive and mean, and every time they got close, it would charge and they'd have to scatter. Sarah's horse spooked when she got too close, reared up and threw her, and she landed hard near the corral fence. The bull saw her, saw movement on the ground, and charged. Isaiah was on the other side of the ranch, heard the screams, came running, and arrived just as the bull lowered its head for the gore. He didn't hesitate. Didn't think, just acted. He ran straight at the bull, shouting, waving his arms, drew its attention away from Sarah. The bull turned, charged Isaiah instead, and at the last possible second, Isaiah grabbed the fence rail, swung his body up and over while the bull crashed into the fence below him. Other hands finally got their ropes on the bull while it was dazed from the impact, and they dragged it away. Isaiah jumped down, ran to Sarah, helped her to her feet, asked if she was hurt. She was shaken, bruised, but alive, and she looked at Isaiah like he'd descended from heaven. She thanked him, grabbed his hands in hers, said he'd saved her life, that she'd never forget what he'd done. It was innocent. Gratitude, nothing more. But Clayton saw it from across the ranch, saw his fiancée holding hands with a black man, saw her looking at that black man with admiration, and something inside him broke. He came storming over, shoved Isaiah away from Sarah, demanded to know what the hell he thought he was doing, touching a white woman, putting his hands on her. Sarah tried to explain, said Isaiah had saved her life, that the bull would have killed her if he hadn't intervened. Clayton didn't care, didn't want to hear it, told Isaiah that he better keep his distance from Sarah or there'd be consequences.
That night, Clayton went to his father, told him a version of the story that transformed a rescue into an assault, that painted Isaiah as a black man who'd taken advantage of a chaotic situation to touch a white woman, to overstep boundaries that should never be crossed. He said Isaiah was dangerous, uppity, the kind that didn't know his place and would cause trouble if left unchecked. Silas Crow listened to his son's poison and made a decision. He couldn't just fire Isaiah because other ranch owners had seen the horse incident, had been impressed, and there was a reputation to consider. But he could remind Isaiah and every other black person on his ranch exactly what the rules were, exactly what the consequences of forgetting your place could be. Crow called a meeting of his most trusted men, all former Confederate soldiers, all men who missed the days when they could do whatever they wanted to black folks without any questions asked. He told them it was time to teach a lesson, to send a message, to make sure everyone remembered who ran Crimson Valley. The plan was simple and evil. They'd wait until Sunday evening when most of the ranch hands went into town for their one night off a week. The black workers had their own section of town, a collection of buildings on the east side where they could drink, eat, and relax without white folks complaining about sharing space with them. Crow and his men would ride in, start trouble, rough up a few people, maybe burn a building or two, nothing too serious, just enough to remind folks of the order of things. But they'd specifically target Isaiah, make an example of him, beat him bad enough that he'd either leave town or be so broken he'd never step out of line again. They didn't plan to kill him, not at first. Killing would bring questions, maybe federal marshals, and Crow didn't want that attention. They just wanted to hurt him, humiliate him, break his spirit. What they didn't count on was that Isaiah's spirit was made of something stronger than fear.
Sunday evening arrived, and Isaiah was in town with about 20 other black workers from various ranches, people who'd become his friends over the past months.
They were in a building that served as a church on Sunday morning, a school during the week, and a social hall on Sunday night, a place where people could gather and be themselves without the weight of white supervision. There was music, laughter, children playing while adults talked about their week, shared food, enjoyed the brief freedom they had. Isaiah was sitting with an older man named Jeremiah, a former slave who'd been working ranches since before Isaiah was born. Jeremiah was teaching Isaiah about saving money, about how to buy land when the opportunity came, about building something permanent in a world that wanted black folks to be temporary. It was one of those moments of peace, the kind that makes you believe life might get better, that tomorrow might be easier than today. Then they heard the horses, a lot of them, moving fast through town. Someone looked out the window and saw about 15 riders, all wearing masks, all carrying torches, heading straight for their section of town. People started to panic because everyone knew what masked riders meant. Everyone knew what torches meant. It meant terror, violence, possibly death, the same pattern that had played out across the South for years after the war. Isaiah stood up, told everyone to get the children to the back rooms, told the men to grab anything they could use as a weapon, told them to prepare to defend themselves. Jeremiah grabbed Isaiah's arm, said fighting would just make it worse, that they should hide, wait it out, let the riders do their damage and leave. Isaiah looked at the old man and said hiding hadn't worked in Mississippi, hadn't worked in Louisiana, hadn't worked in Texas, and it wouldn't work in Oklahoma. He said he was done hiding, done running, done letting men like Crow decide whether he lived or died. The riders surrounded the building, and Clayton Crow called out for Isaiah to come outside, said if he came peacefully, no one else would get hurt, that this was between him and the Crow family. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie, but several people looked at Isaiah, silently asking if he'd sacrifice himself to save them. Isaiah walked toward the door, but Jeremiah blocked his path, said that once Isaiah stepped outside, they'd kill him, that surrendering to a mob never ended well. Isaiah nodded, said Jeremiah was right, which was why he wasn't surrendering. He pushed past the old man, opened the door, and stepped outside not as a sacrifice, but as a fighter. And if you want to see what happened next, make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to take a turn that changed the West forever. Isaiah walked out into the street with empty hands raised, and for a moment the riders just watched him, surprised that he'd actually come out. Clayton was at the front, mask pulled down around his neck because he wanted Isaiah to see his face, wanted him to know exactly who was about to destroy him. Clayton started speaking, said Isaiah had embarrassed him, had touched his fiancée, had forgotten his place, and needed to be reminded of what happened to uppity black men who thought they were equal to white folks. He said they were going to beat Isaiah within an inch of his life, and then he'd have 24 hours to leave the territory, or they'd finish the job. Isaiah listened to the whole speech, calm as still water, and when Clayton was done, Isaiah said one word: no. The word hung in the air like gun smoke, and you could see the confusion on Clayton's face. He asked what Isaiah meant by no, and Isaiah explained real clear. He said he hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't touched Sarah inappropriately, had saved her life, and if Clayton had a problem with that, they could settle it like men instead of Clayton hiding behind 15 riders in masks. He said if Clayton wanted to beat him, they could fight one-on-one, no weapons, no help, just two men settling a dispute the honest way. The other riders started laughing, thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, a black man challenging a white man to a fair fight.
But Clayton's face turned red because saying yes would mean he'd have to actually fight Isaiah one-on-one, and everyone there knew Isaiah would destroy him. Saying no would make him look like a coward who needed an army to handle one man. Clayton made a decision born of rage and stupidity. He pulled his pistol and aimed it at Isaiah's chest, said there wasn't going to be a fair fight, that the rules didn't apply to people like Isaiah, that he was going to shoot him down like a dog and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. He cocked the hammer, finger on the trigger, and Isaiah stood there straight-backed, looking Clayton in the eye without fear. It wasn't that Isaiah wanted to die. He just knew that begging wouldn't save him, that running would just mean getting shot in the back, and if he was going to die, he'd die on his feet, looking his killer in the face. But before Clayton could pull the trigger, Sarah Miller's voice cut through the night. She'd heard about the raid, had ridden into town to stop it, and now she pushed her horse between Clayton and Isaiah, told her fiancé to put the gun down.
Sarah said if Clayton killed Isaiah, she'd tell everyone the truth, that Isaiah had saved her life, that there'd been nothing inappropriate about it, that Clayton was murdering an innocent man out of jealousy and spite. She said she'd break off the engagement, ruin Clayton's reputation, make sure everyone in the territory knew what kind of coward he was. It was a threat that carried weight because Sarah's father had connections in Denver and Santa Fe, had relationships with newspapers and politicians. Clayton lowered the gun, but Silas Crow rode forward, and the older Crow was smarter and more dangerous than his son. Silas told Sarah to go home, that this was men's business, that she didn't understand what was at stake. When Sarah refused, Silas changed tactics. He said fine, Isaiah could live, but he was fired and had to leave town by morning. He said any ranch that hired Isaiah would be considered an enemy of the Crow family, that any store that sold him supplies would lose Crow's business. He was essentially banishing Isaiah, making him an outcast, ensuring he'd starve or freeze because no one would risk Crow's anger to help him. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Isaiah spoke first. He thanked Sarah for her intervention, said he appreciated her standing up for truth, but that he'd handle things from here. He looked at Silas Crow and said he'd leave by morning. No trouble, no fuss. The Crows had won, or so they thought, and the riders turned their horses to leave, satisfied that they'd put Isaiah in his place without having to kill him. But as they were leaving, one of the riders threw his torch onto the roof of the building where people were still hiding, and within seconds, the dry wood caught fire. The flames spread fast, faster than anyone expected, and the building was filled with people who'd hidden in back rooms, people who were now trapped as fire consumed the only exit. Screams came from inside, parents calling for children, children calling for parents, the sound of absolute terror.
Isaiah ran toward the burning building while everyone else stood frozen, and he crashed through the door into a wall of heat and smoke. You couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. The smoke was thick as mud, burning your lungs with every breath. Isaiah dropped to his knees where the air was clearer, crawled toward the screams, found people huddled in corners, confused and panicking. He started guiding them toward the door, pushing them toward where he remembered the exit being, his voice cutting through the chaos, telling them to stay low, keep moving, follow his voice. He made 3 trips into that building, each time bringing out people who would have died if left behind. On the 3rd trip, part of the roof collapsed. A burning beam fell and caught Isaiah across the back and shoulder, pinned him to the ground. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever felt, like being branded by the sun itself, and Isaiah could feel his clothes catching fire, could smell his own flesh burning. He tried to push the beam off, but it was too heavy, too hot to touch, and the smoke was filling his lungs, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. He was going to die in this building, killed by fire set by men too cowardly to fight him fair. But then hands grabbed him. Jeremiah and 2 other men had come back in, had seen Isaiah go down. They lifted the beam, dragged Isaiah toward the door, and pulled him out into the street just as the building's wall started to collapse.
Isaiah lay in the dirt, gasping for air, his back burned and bleeding, watching everything he'd tried to build in Crimson Valley literally go up in smoke. The riders were long gone by then, disappeared into the night like the cowards they were. The black section of town was in chaos. People trying to put out fires, tend to the injured, comfort the traumatized. Sarah stayed to help, using her family's wagon to bring medical supplies, and she worked alongside people her fiancé had just tried to terrorize. A black woman who'd been a nurse during the war cleaned and bandaged Isaiah's burns, said he was lucky to be alive, that a few more seconds under that beam and he'd have burned to death. She told him he needed to rest, let his body heal, that he'd done enough for one night. But Isaiah wasn't done, wasn't anywhere close to done. He asked Jeremiah to help him stand, and when the old man protested, Isaiah said he was leaving town tonight, not in the morning, and he needed to get his horse in gear from the ranch. Jeremiah said going back to the ranch was suicide, that Crow would kill him the moment he showed up, that Isaiah needed to run east, get across the border into Arkansas or Kansas, disappear into a place where the Crow name didn't mean anything. Isaiah said running wouldn't solve anything, would just move the problem somewhere else. He said Silas Crow thought he'd won, thought he'd broken Isaiah's spirit, sent a message that would keep all the other black workers in line. But the only message Isaiah received was that there were men in this world who thought other people's lives were worth less than nothing, who'd burn down a building full of innocent folks just to make a point. And Isaiah said those men needed to learn a lesson themselves, needed to understand that violence begets violence, that terror works both ways, that sometimes the oppressed stop turning the other cheek and start hitting back.
Sarah overheard this conversation, and she knew what Isaiah was planning. She grabbed his arm, said revenge would only get him killed, that the law wouldn't protect him, that no matter what he did to the Crows, the world would call him a criminal, while they called the Crows defenders. Isaiah looked at this young white woman who'd risked everything to save his life, and he told her something that she'd remember for the rest of her days. He said the law had never protected people who looked like him, that justice had always been something other people received, while his people got brutality. He said he wasn't looking for the law's protection anymore, wasn't interested in justice from a system that was designed to deny it to him. He was looking for something more primal, more honest. He was looking for balance, an eye for an eye, fire for fire, blood for blood. Isaiah mounted his horse, Justice, despite the pain from his burns, and he rode toward the Crow Ranch under a moonless sky with murder in his heart and nothing left to lose. And this is where the legend really begins, where a cowboy became something more, something darker, something necessary. Make sure you drop a comment below and tell me if you think Isaiah was justified in what he was about to do, because the lines between justice and revenge are about to get real blurry.
The Crow Ranch covered 50,000 acres, but the heart of it was a compound where Silas built his main house, bunkhouses for the hands, barns for the horses, and a separate building where he and his former Confederate officers would meet, drink, and relive the war they'd lost. It was to this building that the raiders returned after burning the church, laughing about the night's work, congratulating themselves on putting the black folks back in their place. They were drunk on violence and whiskey, careless in their victory, certain that no consequences would come because consequences never came for men like them. They didn't post guards, didn't think they needed to, couldn't imagine that anyone would be bold or crazy enough to come after them. That was their first mistake. Isaiah reached the ranch around midnight, and he took his time studying the layout, watching the compound from the tree line, noting where lights were on, where guards were stationed, where the horses were kept. The burns on his back were screaming. Every movement felt like being whipped with hot wire. But Isaiah pushed the pain into a corner of his mind where it couldn't distract him. He'd learned this trick during his time as a slave, learned to separate his mind from his body, to endure what couldn't be changed and stay focused on what could. He counted 15 horses outside the meeting hall, which meant all the raiders were inside. He saw guards at the main house and bunkhouses, but no one watching the meeting hall, because Silas Crow believed his reputation was protection enough. Isaiah dismounted about a quarter-mile from the compound, left Justice tied to a tree with instructions to the horse that if he didn't return by sunrise, to head back to the black section of town where someone would take care of him. He took his Winchester, checked that it was loaded, and grabbed a can of kerosene from the ranch's supply shed where he'd worked for months and knew every item's location. He moved through the darkness like smoke, using every bit of cover, moving when clouds covered the stars, freezing when they passed. He reached the meeting hall and could hear the men inside, laughing, telling stories about what they'd done, making plans for what they'd do next. Someone suggested they should have killed Isaiah, that letting him leave was a mistake. Another voice said it didn't matter, that Isaiah was broken now, would tell all the other black folks what happened when you stepped out of line. Isaiah listened to men casually discussing his murder like they were talking about the weather, and something cold settled into his chest, something that pushed out fear and pain and doubt. He poured kerosene along the building's walls, emptied the entire can until the wood was soaked with it, the smell sharp enough to burn your nose. Then he walked to the front door, the only exit from the building, and he wedged it shut with boards he'd carried from the supply shed. It wasn't a perfect blockade. Determined men could break through it, but it would slow them down, give fire time to spread, give terror time to set in. Isaiah struck a match, watched the small flame dance in his hand, and thought about all the fires that had been set over the years, all the homes burned, all the churches destroyed, all the lives consumed. He thought about the building that burned tonight, the people who'd almost died, the children who'd screamed in fear. He dropped the match.
The kerosene caught instantly, flames racing along the walls in both directions, meeting at the back of the building in seconds. The wood was dry, the fire hungry, and within a minute, the entire structure was outlined in orange light. Inside, the men noticed smoke first, then heat. Then they saw flames crawling up the walls. Panic replaced confidence real quick, and they rushed to the door. Found it blocked. They started kicking it, slamming shoulders into it, and the door shook, but held. Smoke was filling the hall, thick and black, and you could hear them coughing, cursing, screaming. Some tried to break windows, but the windows were small and high up, designed to keep out the heat during summer, and only a few men could fit through at a time. Clayton Crow was one of the first to reach a window, pushed smaller men out of the way, and started climbing through. He was halfway out when he saw Isaiah standing in the firelight, Winchester rifle aimed at him. Clayton froze, half in and half out of a burning building, and he looked into Isaiah's eyes and saw his own death looking back. Clayton started begging, said he was sorry, that it was his father's idea, that he just got along with it, that Isaiah didn't have to do this. Isaiah thought about all the men who'd begged over the years, black men, begging not to be sold away from their families, begging not to be whipped, begging not to be hanged, and how their begging had meant nothing. He thought about how Clayton had aimed a gun at him just hours ago with no mercy in his heart, no hesitation, no regret. Isaiah pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the ranch like thunder, and Clayton fell back into the burning building. His body blocked the window, made it harder for others to escape,
And the irony wasn't lost on Isaiah that in death, Clayton was finally good for something. Men were breaking through the front door now, pushing past the boards, spilling out into the night, coughing and burning. And Isaiah was waiting. He worked the Winchester's lever action like he was playing music, every shot finding its target, every target a man who'd ridden tonight to terrorize innocent people. Some of the raiders had guns, fired back, but they were blinded by smoke, confused by flames, couldn't see Isaiah standing in the darkness beyond the firelight. They were shooting at shadows, while Isaiah was shooting at targets lit up like they were on stage.
Silas Crow came through the door last, his clothes smoking, face black with soot, and he had the sense to dive away from the firelight, roll into darkness, and come up with his pistol drone. He was a killer from way back, a man who'd survived ambushes and battles, and his combat instincts were still sharp. He fired toward where he'd seen muzzle flash, and the bullet came close enough that Isaiah felt the wind of its passing. Isaiah dropped flat, crawled to a new position, and waited. Crow fired twice more, both shots missing, and Isaiah could hear the older man's ragged breathing, could track him by sound. When Crow paused to reload, Isaiah took his shot. The bullet hit Crow in the shoulder, spun him around, and he dropped his gun. Isaiah stood up, walked toward Silas Crow while the meeting hall collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks and flame. Crow was on his knees, holding his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked up at Isaiah and didn't beg, didn't apologize. He just said that killing him would bring down hell, that every lawman in the territory would hunt Isaiah, that there was nowhere he could run where the Crow name wouldn't find him. Isaiah said that was probably true, but it didn't change what was about to happen, didn't erase what Crow and his men had done, didn't bring back the years of terror they'd inflicted on people who couldn't fight back. Crow said Isaiah was making a mistake, that revenge wouldn't solve anything, would just make him into the monster they'd always said he was. Isaiah considered those words, and then he said something that became part of the legend, words that got repeated in saloons and campfires for the next 50 years. He said if being called a monster was the price for holding evil accountable, then he'd wear that title proudly. He said he'd rather be feared than forgotten, rather be hunted than helpless. He said Silas Crow had spent years making people afraid, and it was time for Crow to feel what that fear was like. Then Isaiah raised the Winchester and shot Silas Crow through the heart, and the Emperor of Crimson Valley died in the dirt like everyone else. By now, the gunfire and flames had alerted the entire ranch. Hands were running toward the fire, guards were mobilizing, and Isaiah knew he had maybe a minute before he'd be surrounded. He ran back to where Justice was waiting, mounted up despite the agony in his back, and rode hard toward the hills. Behind him, men were shouting, organizing pursuit, saddling horses, but Isaiah had a head start, and he knew this territory. He rode through arroyos and over ridges, used every trick he'd learned in 14 years of working cattle to cover his trail. By dawn, he'd put 20 miles between himself and the ranch, and he stopped near a stream to let Justice drink and to check his burns.
The wounds were bad, worse than he'd thought, and the night's activity had opened some of them up again. Isaiah washed them in the stream, gritted his teeth against the pain, and used strips torn from his shirt to make new bandages. He knew infection was a risk, knew he needed real medical attention, but there was nowhere he could get it. Any doctor in the territory would turn him in or shoot him themselves once they heard what he'd done. He was a wanted man now, probably had a bounty on his head already, and Crow's remaining men would be riding with blood in their eyes. Isaiah had won the battle, but set himself up for a war, and he was one man against an empire's resources. Over the next 3 days, Isaiah stayed in the hills, living off what he could hunt, avoiding any settlements or ranches, watching the trails for pursuit. He saw posses riding out from Crimson Valley, saw wanted posters going up in every town within 50 miles. The poster called him Isaiah Iron Blackwood, wanted for murder, arson, and assault. The reward was $500, dead or alive, a fortune in 1873. Enough money that every bounty hunter and cash-poor cowboy in 3 territories would be looking for him. The poster included a description: 6 feet tall, black, broad shoulders, burns on his back. That last detail told Isaiah someone had talked, probably one of the people he'd saved from the church fire, probably under pressure from Crow's men. But something else was happening, something the Crows hadn't anticipated. In the black communities throughout Oklahoma Territory, people were hearing the story of what Isaiah had done, and instead of being horrified, they were inspired. Word spread that a black cowboy had stood up to Silas Crow, had made him pay for years of terror, had proven that men like Crow could bleed just like anyone else. The story grew with each telling, became larger than life, transformed Isaiah into a fugitive, into a symbol. People who'd never met him started calling him Iron Blackwood, the man who couldn't be broken, the avenger who rode out of fire to bring justice. The legend spread through the underground network of black cowboys, ranch hands, and freedmen who worked throughout the West, people who communicated through coded messages and trusted contacts, a system born from slavery days when information had to travel in secret. Stories reached Kansas, where black homesteaders were fighting to keep their land from white raiders. They reached Texas, where black cowboys on the Chisholm Trail were dealing with discrimination and violence. They reached as far as California, where black miners and settlers heard about a man who'd said enough was enough and made his oppressors pay the price. And everywhere the story went, it changed something in people, planted a seed of resistance, made folks believe that fighting back was possible. But inspiration doesn't stop bullets, and Isaiah knew every day he stayed alive was borrowed time. On the 4th day after the massacre, as he called it in his mind, Isaiah made a decision. He couldn't keep running forever, couldn't spend his life hiding in hills waiting for a posse to find him. He needed allies, needed a place to make a stand, needed to turn this from a manhunt into something bigger. He remembered Jeremiah telling him about a place called Harper's Canyon, about 60 miles north, where a community of black homesteaders had settled on land no one else wanted. The canyon was isolated, defensible, and the people there had a reputation for not cooperating with authorities who didn't respect their rights. If Isaiah could reach Harper's Canyon, he might find sanctuary, or at least a place to rest and heal before making his next move. The journey north was hell. Isaiah's burns were infected now. Fever was setting in, and there were moments when he'd sway in the saddle, barely conscious, only Justice's steady walking keeping him from falling. He'd see things that weren't there. His mother, who died when he was 8, other slaves he'd known who hadn't survived to see freedom, and they'd tell him to keep going, that his story wasn't finished. He'd snap back to reality and realize hours had passed, that Justice had kept walking while Isaiah was lost in fever dreams. On the 6th day, half dead from infection and exhaustion, Isaiah reached the entrance to Harper's Canyon and promptly fell off his horse. He woke up 3 days later in a bed, real sheets and everything, with a woman sitting beside him, replacing bandages on his back. Her name was Ruth Harper, 52 years old, and she'd been one of the first settlers in the canyon, had walked here from Louisiana after the war with nothing but determination and a dream of owning land. She told Isaiah he'd been unconscious for days, burning with fever, and they'd almost lost him twice. She'd used old remedies passed down from her grandmother, herbs and poultices that drew out infection, and somehow they'd worked. She said his horse, Justice, was being cared for and had been asking after him in the way horses do. Then she asked Isaiah if he was the man on the wanted posters, the one who'd killed Silas Crow and burned down his meeting hall. Isaiah thought about lying, but Ruth's eyes told him she already knew the answer, was just giving him a chance to be honest. He said yes, he was that man, and if she wanted him to leave, he'd understand. wouldn't blame her for not wanting that trouble on her doorstep. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, said Isaiah wasn't going anywhere until he could walk without falling over, that Harper's Canyon didn't turn away people who'd stood up to monsters. She said they'd heard the full story from refugees who'd left Crimson Valley after the raid, knew that Isaiah had saved people from the church fire, that he'd been defending himself and his community. She said the folks in Harper's Canyon had been dealing with raiders and claim jumpers for years, and they understood sometimes you had to fight to survive. Over the next 2 weeks, Isaiah healed in Harper's Canyon and learned about the community Ruth had built. There were 43 families living here, all black, all homesteaders who'd claimed land under the Homestead Act and were determined to make it work despite every obstacle thrown at them. They'd built houses, planted crops, raised livestock, created a school for their children, and established a town council that made decisions collectively. They'd also organized a militia because they'd learned that legal land ownership didn't stop white raiders from trying to drive them off, that papers and deeds meant nothing when men showed up with guns and torches. The militia trained regularly, had about 30 able-bodied fighters, and they'd successfully defended the canyon twice already against groups that thought black homesteaders would be easy targets.
Isaiah met the militia's leader, a man named Thomas Reeves who'd been a Buffalo soldier, served in the 10th Cavalry, and fought in the Indian Wars before mustering out and heading west to claim land. Thomas was in his mid-30s, tactical and smart, and he'd seen the wanted posters, knew who Isaiah was. He told Isaiah straight up that having him in Harper's Canyon was a risk, that it might bring attention they didn't want. But he also said that sometimes you had to take risks for principle. He said the canyon's residents had voted, and they had decided to offer Isaiah sanctuary for as long as he needed it. But there were conditions. If lawmen came looking, Isaiah would have to leave rather than bringing violence to the canyon. And if he stayed, he'd contribute to the community's defense and work like everyone else. Isaiah agreed to the terms, and for the next month he worked alongside the people of Harper's Canyon, helping build houses, mend fences, break horses, and train with the militia. It was the closest thing to peace he'd felt since before Crimson Valley, working with people who saw him as a person rather than property or problem. The children in the canyon didn't fear him, despite the stories. They'd gather around and ask him to tell them about the night he burned down Crow's Hall, about how he stood up to bad men. Isaiah would tell them edited versions, leaving out the worst details, focusing on the importance of courage and standing up for what's right. He'd tell them that violence should always be a last resort, but that sometimes it was the only resort left, and when that moment came, you had to be ready. But peace never lasts when you're a wanted man, and after 6 weeks in Harper's Canyon, the outside world came calling. A federal marshal named William Tate arrived at the canyon's entrance with a deputy and a copy of Isaiah's wanted poster. Marshal Tate was different from the local lawmen who worked for men like Crow. He actually believed in the law, in due process, and the idea that justice should be blind. He'd investigated what happened in Crimson Valley, talked to witnesses, heard both sides of the story, and he'd concluded that while Isaiah had definitely committed murder, there were circumstances that needed to be heard by a judge and jury. Tate told Ruth Harper that he was here to arrest Isaiah Blackwood, but he promised that Isaiah would get a fair trial, that he'd personally ensure no lynch mob got to him before he saw a courtroom. Ruth listened to the marshal's promise. Then she told him that Isaiah had left the canyon 2 weeks ago, had headed toward Colorado, and she had no idea where he was now. It was a lie. Isaiah was literally in a barn 50 yards away, helping birth a foal. But Ruth delivered the lie with such conviction that Tate almost believed her. The marshal looked around the canyon, at the people watching him from doorways and windows, and he realized that even if Isaiah was here, he wasn't getting any cooperation. He could force the issue, call in more marshals, search every building, but that would turn ugly fast. Might lead to bloodshed with people who'd done nothing wrong except harbor a fugitive. Tate made a decision that said something about his character. He told Ruth that he'd searched the canyon and found nothing, that he'd report Isaiah was gone, but if she did hear from him, she should pass along a message. The marshals said Isaiah should turn himself in, that running would only make things worse, that eventually he'd be caught or killed, and neither outcome would help anyone. He said there were people who wanted Isaiah dead, but there were also people who believed his story, who understood what happened in Crimson Valley, and those people were organizing, raising money for legal defense, getting affidavits from witnesses. He said if Isaiah came in voluntarily, if he stood trial and told his story publicly, he might actually win, might set a precedent that would protect other black folks in similar situations. Ruth promised to pass along the message if she heard from Isaiah, and the marshal tipped his hat and rode away. That night, the canyon held a meeting to discuss what the marshal said, and opinions were divided. Some folks thought Isaiah should take the chance, that a trial might actually be fair, that his story deserved to be heard. Others said trusting the law was suicide, that no white jury would ever acquit a black man for killing white men no matter what the circumstances, that going to trial was just a slow walk to the gallows. Thomas Reeves said the decision was Isaiah's to make, but if he asked for an opinion, Thomas thought the trial was a trap, that once Isaiah was in custody, too many things could go wrong, too many accidents could happen. Isaiah listened to everyone, appreciated their concern, but he'd already made his decision before the meeting started.
Isaiah stood up and told the people of Harper's Canyon that he was turning himself in. And before anyone could protest, he explained his reasoning. He said Marshal Tate was right, that running forever wasn't living, that he'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, that he'd never have peace or build anything permanent. He said even if the trial ended badly for him, even if he hanged, his story would be public record, would be in newspapers, would reach people who needed to hear it. He said his individual life mattered less than the message his trial could send, that black people had the right to defend themselves, that terror couldn't go unanswered forever. He said if he ran, he was just one man's story, but if he stood trial, he became everybody's story, and if that message cost him his life, it was a price he was willing to pay. Ruth Harper cried when Isaiah finished speaking, not because she thought he was wrong, but because she knew he was right, and it broke her heart. She said if Isaiah was determined to do this, Harper's Canyon would support him, would raise money for a lawyer, would organize witnesses to testify on his behalf, would make sure his story was told truthfully. Thomas Reeves said the militia would escort Isaiah to the nearest federal court, make sure he arrived alive and wasn't ambushed by bounty hunters or Crow's remaining men. And before we see how this trial unfolds, I want you to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me whether you think Isaiah made the right choice. Because what happens next is going to challenge everything you think you know about justice in the Wild West. The journey to the federal courthouse in Fort Smith, Arkansas took 12 days, and Isaiah traveled with an escort of 15 riders from Harper's Canyon militia, all armed, all determined that he'd face a jury rather than a lynch mob. Word spread about the convoy, and people lined the roads in every town they passed through. Black folks mostly, but some white folks too. People who'd heard Isaiah's story and wanted to see the man who'd stood up to Silas Crow. Some shouted encouragement, others threw flowers, and in one town, a group of black women sang hymns as Isaiah rode past. It felt like a funeral and a celebration at the same time, like people were honoring a man they expected to die, but hoped would live.
They reached Fort Smith without incident, and Isaiah surrendered himself to Marshal Tate, who kept his promise about protection. Isaiah was locked in a cell, but it was clean, and he was fed regularly, and no mysterious accidents happened during the night. Ruth Harper arrived a week later with a lawyer she'd hired, a white man from Chicago named Jonathan Pierce, who'd made his reputation defending controversial cases. Pierce had been an abolitionist before the war, had served as a judge advocate in the Union Army, and now specialized in civil rights cases. He was 60 years old, brilliant, and mean as a snake when he smelled injustice. He met with Isaiah for 6 hours, heard the full story, and then he smiled like a shark and said they were going to war. The trial began on a Monday in October 1873, and the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. People standing in the aisles, sitting in the windows, gathering outside to hear the proceedings through open doors. The prosecution was led by a man named Harold Simmons, who represented what was left of the Crow family interests. Simmons painted Isaiah as a violent radical who'd murdered innocent men, committed arson, and terrorized a community. He called witnesses who testified that Silas Crow was a respected rancher, a pillar of the community, a man who'd provided jobs and stability to the territory. They didn't mention his Confederate past, didn't talk about the raid on the church, carefully constructed a narrative where Isaiah was an unprovoked aggressor who'd killed men in cold blood. Then Jonathan Pierce stood up for the defense, and he tore that narrative apart piece by piece. He called Sarah Miller as his first witness, and despite pressure from what remained of her family and threats from Crow's associates, she told the truth. She described how Isaiah had saved her life from the bull, how Clayton had threatened him, how her fiancé and his father's men had raided the black section of town, how they'd burned the church with people inside. She testified that Isaiah had risked his life to save those people, that he'd been burned trying to rescue them, that the raid was terrorism, plain and simple. The prosecution tried to discredit her, suggested she was confused or sympathetic to Isaiah. But Sarah held firm, said she knew exactly what she'd seen, and her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent.
Pierce called witness after witness, people from the black community who'd been at the church that night, who'd seen the rioters, who'd watched Isaiah pull people from the flames. He called the woman who treated Isaiah's burns, who testified about the severity of his injuries, who said he shouldn't have been able to ride a horse, much less attack a ranch in the condition he was in. Pierce established that Isaiah had acted in the immediate aftermath of an attack on his community, that he'd been injured defending others, that he targeted only the men who'd raided the church and not innocent bystanders. He argued that Isaiah had acted in defense of his community, that when the law wouldn't protect black citizens, they had the right to protect themselves. The prosecution countered that Isaiah could have reported the attack to authorities, could have sought legal remedies, that taking the law into his own hands was murder, regardless of provocation. Pierce pointed out that the local sheriff was on the Crow payroll, that there was no authority in Crimson Valley independent of the Crow family, that asking Isaiah to trust the law was asking him to trust his murderers. He pointed out that the same legal system that was now prosecuting Isaiah had done nothing about the church burning, had filed no charges against the raiders, had treated the attack on the black community as if it never happened. Pierce asked the jury if they could honestly say they'd trust a system that only protected some people and only prosecuted others. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and it became a national story. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco covering it, arguing about it, using it as a proxy for larger debates about race, justice, and the meaning of freedom. Some papers called Isaiah a hero, others called him a monster, but everyone was talking about him, arguing about what his actions meant, what they said about America 11 years after emancipation. In black communities across the country, people followed every development, prayed for Isaiah's acquittal, organized rallies in support. In white communities, reactions were mixed. Some folks sympathetic, others outraged that a black man might be acquitted for killing white men.
The jury deliberated for 3 days, and those were the longest 3 days of Isaiah's life. He sat in his cell and thought about everything that had led him to this moment, from being born in chains to burning down the empire of the man who'd tried to break him. He thought about his mother, wondered what she'd think of the man he'd become, whether she'd be proud or horrified. He thought about the people he'd saved from the church fire, about the community in Harper's Canyon who'd risked everything to support him, about Sarah Miller who'd sacrificed her engagement and social standing to tell the truth. He thought about Silas Crow dying in the dirt, and he wondered if he'd do it all again if given the chance. The answer was yes. On the 3rd day, the jury returned with a verdict, and the courthouse fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver it. The charge was murder in the 1st degree of Silas Crow. The jury found Isaiah not guilty. The charge was murder in the 1st degree of Quayton Crow. The jury found Isaiah not guilty. On down the list of charges, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, until the only charge that stuck was arson. And even on that, the jury found mitigating circumstances and recommended leniency. The judge sentenced Isaiah to 6 months already served, given the time he'd spent in jail awaiting trial. And just like that, Isaiah Blackwood was a free man. The courtroom erupted, people cheering and crying, and in black sections of cities across America, celebrations broke out that lasted until dawn. But freedom came with complications. The legal verdict didn't change the fact that Isaiah had killed men, that he'd made enemies, that Crow's associates and allies would want revenge regardless of what a jury said. Jonathan Pierce warned Isaiah that legal trouble might be over, but physical danger definitely wasn't, that they were men who'd see the acquittal as an insult that needed to be answered. Marshall Tate said essentially the same thing, offered to help Isaiah relocate somewhere far from Oklahoma territory, somewhere he could start over with a new identity. Isaiah thanked them both for their concern, but he had other plans. Plans that either cemented his legend or get him killed. And honestly, he was fine with either outcome. Isaiah returned to Harper's Canyon, and the community threw him a celebration that lasted 3 days, with food and music and speeches about courage and justice. But after the celebration, Isaiah called a meeting of the militia and proposed an idea that would change everything. He said his trial had proven that black folks could get justice in American courts if they had resources, organization, and people willing to tell the truth. But most black folks didn't have those things, couldn't afford lawyers like Jonathan Pierce, couldn't take weeks off work to attend trials, couldn't risk testifying against powerful white men. Isaiah proposed creating a network, an organization that would help black cowboys and homesteaders defend themselves legally and physically when they were targeted. The idea was revolutionary for 1873. Isaiah envisioned a group that would investigate attacks on black communities, gather evidence, find witnesses, hire lawyers, and if legal remedies failed, provide armed protection to people under threat. It would operate across territories, share information between communities, create an early warning system when night riders or raiders were organizing. It would train people in self-defense and how to document crimes and how to navigate the legal system. And It would be funded by contributions from black workers throughout the West, small amounts from many people, creating a resource that could challenge the power structures that kept them oppressed. Thomas Reeves loved the idea, said it was what black folks had needed since the end of the war, a way to protect themselves when the government wouldn't. Ruth Harper was more cautious, worried that it would make Isaiah and anyone involved targets for every racist organization in the West. Isaiah said they were already targets, that the only question was whether they'd be targets who fought back or targets who just endured. Over the next month, Isaiah and Thomas traveled to black communities throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, sharing the idea, recruiting people, organizing local chapters of what they called the Freedmen's Protection League. The response was overwhelming. People eager to join, eager to contribute, eager to finally have some defense against the terror they'd lived with for years.
Within 6 months, the League had chapters in 40 towns, over 500 members, and a treasury that could fund legal defenses and provide aid to families who'd been attacked. Isaiah became the public face of the organization, traveling constantly, speaking at churches and town halls, teaching people their rights and how to defend them. He became more than a cowboy who'd survived a massacre. He became an organizer, a leader, a symbol of resistance. Newspapers started calling him the Black Avenger, the Freedmen's Champion, the cowboy who changed the West. Songs were written about him, exaggerating his deeds, turning him into a mythical figure who could dodge bullets and appear wherever black folks needed help. The reality was more complicated and dangerous. The League's success made it enemies, powerful enemies, who saw it as a threat to the racial order they were trying to maintain. Klan groups and other white supremacist organizations targeted League members, burned their homes, attacked their businesses, murdered activists who were too effective at organizing. The League fought back, sometimes legally through courts and newspapers, sometimes physically through armed defense and strategic retaliation. Isaiah himself survived 3 assassination attempts in the first year. Once ambushed on a road, once when someone poisoned his food, once when raiders attacked a house where he was staying. Each time he survived, the legend grew, people saying he was protected by God, by luck, by the spirits of slaves who died fighting for freedom.
The truth was Isaiah survived through paranoia and preparation. He never stayed in the same place more than a night, never followed predictable patterns, never traveled alone, always had an escape route planned. He learned from Thomas Reeves how to spot ambushes, how to read terrain, how to think tactically. He carried multiple weapons, kept his horse in peak condition, developed a network of safe houses and trusted contacts who'd warn him of threats. Living this way was exhausting, meant he could never relax, never let his guard down, never build anything permanent. But it kept him alive, and as long as he was alive, he could keep fighting, keep organizing, keep building the League into something that could outlast him. And the League grew despite the violence against it, maybe because of it. Every attack on League members generated publicity, showed the necessity of the organization, brought in new members and donations. By 1875, 2 years after the massacre at Crimson Valley, the Freedmen's Protection League had chapters in 12 states and territories, over 2,000 members, and had successfully defended black communities against raids in dozens of cases. They'd won court cases that established legal precedents protecting homesteaders' rights, had documented atrocities that newspapers published, had created a system where black folks could call for help and actually receive it. Isaiah's vision of organized resistance was working, and it was driving his enemies crazy. The backlash intensified. State legislatures passed laws targeting the League, calling it a criminal conspiracy, making membership illegal in some jurisdictions.
Federal authorities, under pressure from wealthy landowners and political interests, launched investigations, claiming the League was a violent organization that threatened public order. Newspapers friendly to those interests published articles calling Isaiah a dangerous radical, claiming he was plotting a race war, suggesting he was being funded by mysterious outside agitators. It was all lies or distortions, but lies repeated enough times become truth in some people's minds, and Isaiah found himself fighting a propaganda war on top of everything else. In 1876, Isaiah returned to Oklahoma Territory for the first time since his trial. Came back to organize a new League chapter in a town called Liberty Creek. It was a risk. Oklahoma was where he'd made his most powerful enemies, where bounties might still be active despite the acquittal, where ambush was most likely. But Isaiah believed in facing fear rather than running from it, believed that returning showed strength, showed that he wouldn't be intimidated. He arrived in Liberty Creek on a Thursday afternoon, and by Thursday night, everyone in the territory knew Isaiah Blackwood was back, and people on both sides started preparing for whatever would come next. The new League chapter was organized in a church, with about 60 people attending the inaugural meeting. Isaiah spoke about the importance of unity, about legal rights and self-defense, about building communities strong enough to resist oppression. It was a speech he'd given dozens of times, refined and powerful, and the audience responded with enthusiasm, signing membership rolls, contributing money, volunteering to serve as local leaders. After the meeting, Isaiah was shaking hands and talking with new members when a young man approached, couldn't have been more than 19, and said he had information Isaiah needed to hear in private. They stepped outside, and the young man said his name was Marcus, that he worked at a ranch owned by associates of the late Silas Crow, men who'd never forgotten or forgiven what happened. Marcus said these men had been planning something for weeks, waiting for Isaiah to return to Oklahoma, and now that he was here, they were going to make their move. He said tomorrow night, a group of about 30 armed men were going to attack the church where the League chapter met, burn it down with everyone inside, make it look like an accident, a lamp tipped over, tragedy but nothing criminal. Marcus said they were going to do to Isaiah and the League what Isaiah had done to the Crow meeting hall, turn his own tactics against him. Isaiah asked Marcus why he was revealing this, risking his life to warn someone he'd just met. Marcus said he'd been at the Crow Ranch the night of the massacre, had been there as a stable hand, had seen everything. He said he'd watched Isaiah burn down that hall, and at the time he'd been terrified, had thought Isaiah was a monster. But over the years, he'd learned the full story, understood what had happened before Isaiah's attack, realized that monsters were the men who'd raided the church and tried to kill innocent people. Marcus said he didn't want to be part of another massacre, didn't want to live with that on his conscience. And if warning Isaiah made him a traitor to white folks, then so be it. He'd rather be a traitor than a murderer. Isaiah thanked Marcus, asked if he'd be willing to testify if it came to that, and Marcus said he would, said he was done being silent about the things he'd seen. Isaiah told him to get somewhere safe, to be ready to disappear if necessary, because once the attack didn't happen as planned, they'd know someone had warned their target. Then Isaiah went back inside the church and told the League members there'd been a change of plans, that they needed to prepare for battle, that tomorrow night they'd show Oklahoma Territory that the days of unopposed violence against black communities were over. And if you want to see how this final confrontation plays out, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on, because this story is building to a climax that's going to blow your mind. The next day, Isaiah and the Liberty Creek League chapter prepared their defense. They evacuated the children and elderly to safe locations outside town, brought in League members from neighboring communities, and fortified the church with sandbags and barricades. They positioned armed defenders in buildings around the church, set up fields of fire, created multiple defensive positions that could support each other. Isaiah wanted to avoid a massacre if possible, wanted to demonstrate force sufficient to deter attack, but if fighting was inevitable, they'd be ready. Thomas Reeves arrived from Harper's Canyon with 10 militia members, and he helped Isaiah refine the tactical plan, drawing on his military experience to maximize their defensive advantages.
As night fell, they sent most of the League members home, keeping only the fighters, about 40 men and women who'd volunteered to defend the church. Isaiah addressed them before the attack came, told them they were making history, that what happened tonight would be remembered, would show whether black folks could successfully defend their communities against organized violence. He told them the goal was to survive and protect each other, that killing attackers was acceptable but not the objective, that demonstrating strength and resolve was more important than body counts. He told them to shoot to wound if possible, to give attackers chances to retreat, but to show no mercy to anyone who kept coming. The attackers arrived around midnight. 30 riders, just like Marcus had said, armed with rifles and torches, expecting to surround a church full of sleeping people and burn them alive. Instead, they found a fortified position with defenders ready and waiting. Isaiah called out from behind the church's barricades, told the riders they'd been expected, that the church was defended, that they should turn around and go home before people got hurt. The riders' leader, a ranch foreman named Polk, who'd been one of Silas Crow's most trusted men, shouted back that Isaiah had killed his boss and burned his friends, that tonight was payback, that every person in that church was going to die screaming. Isaiah's response became one of the most quoted lines in Wild West history. He said if Polk wanted payback, he was welcome to come and take it. But he should understand that the days of murdering black folks without consequences were over, that this wasn't 1858 or even 1868, that the world had changed, and men like Polk needed to change with it or get buried by it. Then Isaiah fired a warning shot that knocked Polk's hat off his head, and all hell broke loose. The riders charged the church, and defenders opened fire from multiple positions, creating a crossfire that was devastating. Riders fell from horses, others wheeled and retreated, the attack falling apart within seconds because they'd expected victims and found soldiers.
The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours to the people involved. Polk and 3 other riders died in the initial exchange. Another 6 were wounded seriously enough that they couldn't ride. The remaining attackers retreated in disorder, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The plan to massacre the League members turned into their own disaster. The defenders suffered only 2 injuries, both minor, and the church building was intact. Not a single torch had reached it. As dawn broke over Liberty Creek, the message was clear and unmistakable. The Freemen's Protection League could defend itself, would defend itself, and anyone who attacked them would pay a price. News of the Liberty Creek defense spread across the West faster than any story before it, amplified by telegraph and newspapers, becoming a symbol and turning point. For black communities, it was proof that organized resistance worked, that standing together could defeat terror. For white supremacist groups, it was a warning that the easy targets they'd enjoyed for decades were hardening, fighting back, becoming dangerous to attack. For historians looking back, Liberty Creek marked the moment when Reconstruction-era violence started shifting, when the oppressed stopped just enduring and started imposing costs on their oppressors. Isaiah Blackwood became more than a man. He became a movement, an idea,
a promise that justice was possible if you were willing to fight for it.
Over the next decade, the Freedmen's Protection League continued to grow and evolve. It successfully defended dozens of communities against attacks, won hundreds of court cases protecting black folks' rights, organized economic cooperatives and mutual aid societies. The League became a template for other civil rights organizations, showing that combining legal action, economic organizing, and armed self-defense could challenge systems of oppression. Isaiah remained involved, but gradually stepped back from leadership, training new organizers to take his place, understanding that movements that depend on one person die when that person does. By 1886, the League had over 10,000 members, operated in 20 states, and had become one of the most significant black organizations in America. And Isaiah could claim to have helped build it from ashes and anger into something real and lasting. But success came with costs. Isaiah never stopped being a target, never stopped looking over his shoulder, never got to experience the peace he'd fought for. He never married, never had children, couldn't risk making anyone a target by association with him. He lived in a series of safe houses and temporary shelters, never owned property, never built the ranch he'd dreamed about when he rode into Crimson Valley all those years ago. Friends died around him, killed by enemies who couldn't get to Isaiah directly, but could hurt him by hurting people he cared about. Ruth Harper was murdered in 1882 by rioters who burned down her home, and Isaiah blamed himself, even though everyone told him it wasn't his fault. Thomas Reeves died in 1884 defending a League chapter from attack, and Isaiah was the one who had to tell Thomas's wife she was a widow.
The personal toll of being a symbol, a leader, a target, wore on Isaiah in ways that bullets and fire never could. He developed a reputation for being distant, hard to know, someone who kept even friends at arm's length. People who met him said his eyes were haunted, that he seemed tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. He was only 40 years old in 1887, but he looked 60, weathered by violence and loss and the weight of expectations. There were nights when he'd wonder if all the fighting had been worth it, if the League's victories balanced the cost in blood, if he'd made the world better or just different. But then he'd receive a letter from a mother whose children had been educated by a League school, or from a farmer who'd kept his land because League lawyers defended him. And Isaiah would remember why he'd started this, remember that every person helped, justified the struggle. In 1888, Isaiah was invited to speak at a convention of black leaders in Washington, D.C., a gathering of ministers, educators, politicians, and activists discussing the future of black America. It was a prestigious invitation, recognition that Isaiah and the League had become important voices in national conversations about civil rights. Isaiah was reluctant to attend, didn't like being far from the West, where he knew the terrain and had support networks. But people he respected convinced him that his story needed to be heard by powerful folks who could influence policy. So in July 1888, Isaiah Blackwood traveled east for the first time since the war, riding trains through country that looked nothing like the prairies and deserts he called home. The convention was held in a grand hall, attended by over 300 people, and Isaiah's speech was scheduled for the final day, the culminating address that would tie together the week's discussions. When Isaiah took the stage, he looked out at an audience of well-dressed, educated black folks,
people who'd achieved success within the system, people who represented hope for what was possible. And Isaiah told them the truth, even though it wasn't what they wanted to hear. He said that legal rights meant nothing without the power to defend them, that court victories were temporary, unless backed by strength, that the violence of oppression would continue until oppressors feared consequences. He said he'd spent 15 years fighting, organizing, building, and for all that effort, the basic situation hadn't changed much. Black folks were still being murdered, land was still being stolen, rights were still being violated, just more carefully, more legally, more subtly than before. Isaiah said the League had won battles, but hadn't won the war, that the forces they were fighting had deeper resources, longer patience, and institutional power that individual courage couldn't match. He said what was needed wasn't more speeches or conventions or polite requests for justice. What was needed was political power, economic independence, and yes, continued willingness to fight physically when necessary. He said freedom wasn't given, wasn't negotiated, wasn't earned through good behavior. Freedom was taken, defended, and constantly reasserted. And any group that forgot that lesson would lose everything they'd gained.
The speech was controversial, made some people uncomfortable, challenged the respectability politics that many black leaders had embraced as the path forward. Some of the audience applauded, others sat in stony silence, and the newspapers covered the speech with headlines like "Radical Cowboy Advocates Violence" and "Former Fugitive Divides Black Leadership." But Isaiah didn't care about the criticism, had never cared about being popular or acceptable to people who valued order over justice. He said what he believed needed saying, delivered the message he traveled 2,000 miles to deliver, and then he went home to the West, where the fights were real and immediate rather than theoretical and distant. The trip back west was when Isaiah realized he was being followed. It was subtle at first, the same faces appearing in different train stations, a man who got off when Isaiah got off and boarded when Isaiah boarded. Isaiah's survival instincts, honed by 15 years of being hunted, told him this was surveillance, someone tracking his movements, learning his patterns. He couldn't tell if it was law enforcement, private detectives hired by his enemies, or assassins waiting for the right moment to strike. What he did know was that returning to his usual safe houses and contacts would expose them to danger, that whoever was following him was using Isaiah to map the League's network. So Isaiah did something unexpected. He disappeared. In Kansas City, Isaiah got off the train, walked into the station's crowd, and used every trick he'd learned to lose a tail. He changed clothes in a public bathroom, bought a ticket to Denver under a false name, doubled back through alleys and side streets, watched to see if anyone followed. When he was confident he'd lost them, he didn't head toward League safe houses or known associates. Instead, he rode north into territory he'd never visited, small towns where no one knew Isaiah Blackwood, where he could be just another black cowboy looking for work. He spent 6 months moving through Nebraska and the Dakotas, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, living anonymously while he tried to figure out who'd been following him and why.
During those months of anonymity, Isaiah had time to think about his life, about what he'd accomplished and what it had cost. He was 41 years old and felt ancient, had more scars than he could count, had killed men he could name and remember clearly. He'd helped build an organization that protected people, but he wondered if the violence required to build it had corrupted something fundamental, if fighting monsters for so long had made him monstrous. He thought about a conversation he'd had with Ruth Harper before she died, when she'd asked him if he ever regretted burning down that meeting hall, killing those men. Isaiah had told her no, that he'd do it again, that some evils needed violent answers. Ruth had looked sad and said she believed him, but she hoped he'd find peace someday, hoped the anger that fueled him wouldn't consume him entirely. Isaiah realized during those months that he'd never found peace, didn't know if he even wanted it anymore, had become so accustomed to fighting that he didn't know who he'd be without an enemy to face. The struggle had given his life meaning, purpose, direction, and without it, he'd be just another aging cowboy with a violent past and no future. That realization was terrifying, because it meant his identity was wrapped up in conflict, that he needed oppression to exist in order to define himself against it. Isaiah wondered if that was true for the League as a whole, if they'd built an organization designed for perpetual struggle without thinking about what victory would actually look like or how to achieve it.
These thoughts were depressing and cyclical, and Isaiah might have stayed lost in them if not for a letter that reached him in a town called Crawford, forwarded through a series of League contacts who tracked his movements despite his attempts to disappear. The letter was from Thomas Reeves's widow, Rebecca, and it said that the League was in crisis, fracturing along generational and philosophical lines. Younger members wanted more aggressive action, more violence, more direct confrontation with white power structures. Older members wanted more focus on legal victories and building institutions. The disagreement had become personal and bitter. Chapters were breaking away from the central organization, and without someone to unite the factions, the League might collapse into irrelevance or factional warfare. Rebecca said Isaiah was the only person both sides respected, the only leader who could hold the organization together, and she was begging him to come home and save what he'd built. Isaiah's first instinct was to ignore the letter, to stay hidden and let the League figure things out without him, to finally have the peace he'd claimed to want. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't walk away when people he'd fought beside for 15 years needed him. Couldn't let the organization die because he was tired of fighting. So in January 1889, Isaiah Blackwood emerged from hiding and returned to Harper's Canyon, where the League's National Council was meeting to decide the organization's future. When Isaiah walked into the meeting, conversation stopped. People stared like they were seeing a ghost, and someone started crying. Isaiah had been gone for 8 months. There'd been rumors he was dead, and his return felt like resurrection. The council meeting lasted 3 days, and it was brutal, angry. Everything simmering beneath the surface coming out in accusations and recriminations. Young activists accused older leaders of being too cautious, too willing to accept incremental progress, too afraid to take real action. Older leaders accused younger members of being reckless, of not understanding consequences, of potentially destroying in moments what had taken years to build. Isaiah listened to both sides, heard valid points mixed with ego and stubbornness, and realized the fundamental disagreement wasn't about tactics, it was about hope. The younger members still believed they could win, could achieve real equality, could force America to live up to its promises. The older members, including Isaiah, had been fighting long enough to doubt victory was possible, to see the struggle as something perpetual rather than something winnable. On the third day, Isaiah spoke to the council, and what he said surprised everyone. He said both sides were right and both were wrong, that the League needed aggressive action and patient institution building, needed to fight on legal grounds and be willing to defend themselves physically, needed hope for victory and realistic acknowledgement of how hard victory would be. He said the mistake was thinking these approaches were contradictory, that you had to choose one or the other. The truth was, you needed all of them. Different tactics for different situations, different strategies for different threats.
flexibility rather than rigid ideology. He said if the League was going to survive, it needed to be many things to many people, needed to accept that unity didn't mean uniformity.
Isaiah proposed a reorganization that would give local chapters more autonomy to adapt strategies to their specific situations while maintaining a national structure for coordination and resource sharing. He said, younger leaders should be elevated to positions of authority, not to replace older leaders, but to work alongside them, combining experience with fresh perspective and energy. He said the League should expand its focus beyond just defensive actions, should start building the kind of economic and political power that could challenge systems rather than just react to attacks. And he said he was stepping down as a public figure, that his time as the face of the movement was over, that new leaders needed to emerge who represented the League's future rather than its founding. The proposal was accepted after hours of debate and amendment, and the reorganized Freemen's Protection League emerged stronger and more resilient than before. New leaders stepped forward, people who'd been mentored by Isaiah and Thomas and Ruth, people who carried the old struggle's lessons without being trapped by them. The League expanded into new territories, started businesses and cooperatives, ran candidates for local office, built schools and medical clinics, became an institution rather than just a resistance movement. And Isaiah kept his promise to step back, turning down leadership positions, refusing to be the public face, working behind the scenes to train and support new organizers.
But stepping back didn't mean disappearing, and Isaiah spent the 1890s traveling throughout the West, showing up wherever the League faced serious threats, lending his experience and reputation to local struggles. He was at the Red River Standoff in 1891, when 30 League members held off a 100-man posse trying to evict black homesteaders from legally owned land. He was at the Cimarron Valley negotiations in 1893, when League representatives met with territorial officials to establish formal recognition of black settlements and their rights. He was at the Boulder Creek defense in 1895, when League militia fought a 3-day battle against night riders, killing 12 attackers and losing only 2 defenders. Isaiah was always there when things were worst, appearing like a dark angel to even the odds, and then disappearing again once the crisis passed. The stories about these appearances grew with each telling, transformed Isaiah into something beyond human, a legend who couldn't be killed, who appeared wherever justice needed defending, who struck fear into the hearts of evil men. People claimed to have seen him in multiple places at the same time, said he could vanish into shadows, that bullets passed through him without effect. The real Isaiah was aging, slowing down, accumulating injuries that didn't heal as fast as they used to, but the legendary Isaiah Blackwood was eternal, unchanging, a symbol that transcended the man. And Isaiah let the legend grow, understood that myths could protect people in ways that facts couldn't, that sometimes belief in a protector mattered more than the protector's actual existence. In 1898, 25 years after the Crimson Valley Massacre, Isaiah was 51 years old and looked 70, used a cane to walk because his left leg had never fully recovered from a bullet wound, had hearing damage from too many gunfights, sometimes coughed blood from old lung injuries. He knew he was dying slowly, that the accumulated trauma of a violent life was catching up to him, and that he had years rather than decades left. He started thinking about legacy, about what he'd leave behind when he was gone, whether the fighting and sacrifice had mattered. The League was thriving, had over 20,000 members, had protected countless communities and saved thousands of lives. That should have been enough, should have given Isaiah peace. But something nagged at him, unfinished business that wouldn't let him rest.
That unfinished business was Crimson Valley, the place where everything started, the town that hadn't seen Isaiah since the night he'd burned it down.
Isaiah heard through League contacts that the valley had changed dramatically since Silas Crow's death, that without his iron control, the ranch had been divided and sold, that new settlers had moved in, that black and white families were living together without the terror that had defined the Crow era. Some of the people who'd been at the church fire had moved back, reclaimed land they'd been forced to abandon, started building lives they'd been denied before. Isaiah wanted to see it, wanted to know if anything good had grown from the ashes he'd created, wanted to walk through the valley one last time before he died. So, in October 1898, Isaiah Blackwood rode back to Crimson Valley for the first time in a quarter century, and what he found there stunned him. The town had been renamed, was now called Freedom Valley, and the main street featured a monument to the church fire victims, listing the names of people who died and noting that they'd been killed by terrorist attack. Language that would have been impossible in 1873. The old Crow Ranch was split among several smaller operations, some owned by white families, some by black families, all apparently coexisting without the violence that had been routine before. The school that the League had helped fund was teaching both black and white children in the same building, revolutionary for Oklahoma Territory. And when Isaiah visited, he saw children who couldn't have imagined 25 years ago, sitting side by side, learning together.
Jonathan said the legal precedents from Isaiah's trial had been cited in dozens of subsequent cases, had helped establish the principle that self-defense applied to communities as well as individuals, that terroristic violence voided normal legal protections for attackers. He said Isaiah's case had been studied by lawyers and civil rights advocates for decades, had influenced thinking about how to challenge systems of oppression through both legal and extra-legal means. He said history would remember Isaiah as one of the most important figures in the struggle for black rights, someone who'd shown that resistance was possible and effective, that courage could defeat terror if you were willing to pay the price. Isaiah listened to all this and felt something strange, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. It might have been satisfaction, might have been peace, might have been simple exhaustion finally releasing its grip. He told Sarah and Jonathan that he'd come to Crimson Valley expecting to find his failure, expecting to see that nothing had really changed, that all the fighting had been pointless. But what he'd found was a town that had transformed, a community that had learned to exist differently, children growing up without the hate that had poisoned previous generations. He said maybe the fire he'd started all those years ago had burned away more than just buildings. Maybe it had burned away some of the rot in people's souls, created space for something better to grow. That night, Isaiah slept in a real bed for the first time in months, in a house where he felt safe, surrounded by people who cared about him, and he had the best sleep of his adult life. He woke up feeling almost young, the pain in his body distant and manageable, his mind clear and focused. He had breakfast with Sarah and Jonathan, thanked them for their hospitality and their friendship, told them it had meant more than they knew. Then he saddled Justice, who was as old and weathered as Isaiah, but still strong enough for one more ride, and he headed toward Harper's Canyon, intending to spend his remaining time with the community that had sheltered him when he needed it most.
He never made it to Harper's Canyon.
About 30 miles from Freedom Valley, on a stretch of prairie under an enormous sky, Isaiah's heart simply stopped, gave out after 51 years of carrying the weight of trauma and struggle and determination. He fell from his horse, lay on his back in the grass, and died looking at clouds drifting across blue forever. Justice stayed with his body, stood guard like he'd been trained to do, and that's how a league patrol found them 3 hours later. An old horse watching over an old rider who'd finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. The funeral was held in Harper's Canyon, and over 3,000 people attended. League members from 20 states, people who'd known Isaiah personally, and people who only knew the legend. They buried him next to Ruth Harper and Thomas Reeves, the three of them together in death as they'd been in struggle. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates and one line: "He stood when others fell." Speakers at the funeral talked about Isaiah's courage, his sacrifice, his impact on the fight for freedom. But the most moving tribute came from a 10-year-old girl who'd been born in Freedom Valley after it changed, who'd grown up in a world that Isaiah's violence had helped create. She recited a poem she'd written about a cowboy who rode through fire and taught people not to be afraid. And by the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering.
After Isaiah's death, the legend grew even faster, detached completely from the complicated reality of who he'd been. Songs were written, turning him into a folk hero who'd fought for justice across the West. Books appeared, some factual, some wildly exaggerated, all contributing to the mythology. Black children throughout America heard stories about Isaiah Blackwood, the cowboy who refused to bow, who fought back when fighting back seemed impossible, who proved that resistance could succeed. His name became a rallying cry, a symbol invoked during civil rights struggles for the next century. When activists in the 1960s talked about armed self-defense, they referenced Isaiah. When scholars discussed resistance to racial terror, they studied what he built. When artists imagined black heroes of the American West, they drew inspiration from his story. But the most important legacy wasn't the legend, it was the institution he'd helped create. The Freemen's Protection League continued operating into the 20th century, evolved into new organizations as circumstances changed, but never abandoned its core mission of helping black folks defend themselves when the system wouldn't. The League's model of combining legal action, economic organizing, and armed self-defense influenced countless subsequent movements, from the Deacons for Defense to the Black Panthers and beyond. Every group that argued for the right of oppressed people to protect themselves by any means necessary was walking a path that Isaiah had helped clear, standing on foundations he'd laid with blood and fire.
Historians argue about Isaiah Blackwood's legacy, about whether his violence was justified, whether the ends justified the means, whether there might have been better ways to achieve the same results. But those historians weren't there in Crimson Valley when the church burned, weren't there when the legal system offered no protection, weren't there when the choice was fight or die. Isaiah made the only choice that made sense to him in that moment, And that choice echoed across history, showed other people facing similar situations that submission wasn't the only option, that you could fight back, and maybe, just maybe, you could win. Whether that makes him a hero or something more complicated is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. What's undeniable is that Isaiah Blackwood's story matters, that it reveals truths about America that some people would prefer to keep buried. It shows that the West wasn't just cowboys and Indians, white hats and black hats, simple stories of civilization defeating savagery. It was complicated, violent, racist, and yet also full of people like Isaiah who refused to accept the roles they were assigned, who fought for dignity and justice and freedom when those things weren't given freely. It shows that black people weren't just victims waiting to be saved. They were active participants in their own liberation, willing to take enormous risks and make terrible sacrifices to create better futures for their children. And it shows that change doesn't come from asking nicely or waiting patiently. It comes from people willing to draw lines and defend them, to say this far and no further, to pay whatever price freedom demands. The massacre at Crimson Valley was supposed to break Isaiah Blackwood, supposed to show him his place, supposed to terrorize him and everyone like him into submission. Instead, it created a legend, sparked a movement, changed the trajectory of civil rights struggle in America. The men who burned that church thought they were defending an order, preserving a way of life, teaching necessary lessons. What they actually did was light a fire that burned far beyond that one building, that consumed their empire, that showed people across the West that terror could be answered with terror, that violence flowed in both directions, that the oppressed could become the avengers. Isaiah paid a terrible price for that lesson, gave up any chance at normal life, died young and alone on a prairie far from home. But he lived according to his own terms, fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves, built something that outlasted him, and in doing so, became immortal.
So the next time someone tells you the Wild West was won by brave pioneers and righteous lawmen, remember Isaiah Blackwood. Remember that for every white hero mythology celebrates, there were black cowboys, indigenous warriors, Chinese railroad workers, Mexican vaqueros, people whose stories were deliberately erased because they complicated the narrative of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. Remember that freedom has always been something taken rather than given, defended rather than granted, paid for in blood by people willing to bleed. Remember that sometimes the worst moment of your life becomes the beginning of your legend, that massacres can create martyrs or they can create avengers, and which one emerges depends entirely on whether you choose to stay down or stand back up. Isaiah Blackwood chose to stand, chose to fight, chose to burn down the world that tried to burn him. Whether you call him a hero, a vigilante, a terrorist, or a freedom fighter depends on where you stand and what you believe about justice, violence, and the price of freedom. But what you can't call him is forgotten. His story survived, his legacy endured, his example inspired generations, and his name still resonates more than a century after his death. That's what legends are made of, not perfection, not simple morality, but complicated people making hard choices in impossible situations and refusing to be defeated by circumstances designed to destroy them.
And that's the story of Isaiah Iron Blackwood, the black cowboy who became a legend after a massacre. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged what you thought you knew about the Wild West, then do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people can discover these untold histories. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep bringing you stories that Hollywood forgot, that history books buried, that need to be told honestly and completely. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about Isaiah's choices, whether you believe his violence was justified, whether the ends justified the means, because these are questions that still matter today. that still impact how we think about resistance and justice and freedom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who thinks the struggle for equality was polite and peaceful, someone who should know that freedom has always come at a price, and someone always had to pay it. The Wild West wasn't what they taught you in school, wasn't what you saw in movies, wasn't a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It was complicated, brutal, beautiful, and full of people like Isaiah Blackwood who refused to accept the destinies others assigned them. Their stories deserve to be told, deserve to be remembered, deserve to reshape how we understand American history and the ongoing struggle for justice. Thanks for riding with me through this story, for sticking with it all the way to the end, for caring enough about truth to spend time learning what really happened. Until next time, remember that legends aren't born, they're made, usually in fire, always through struggle, and sometimes from the ashes of massacres that were meant to destroy, but instead created something eternal. Stay strong, stay curious, and never forget that your story matters too. That every person has the potential to become legendary if they're willing to stand for something bigger than themselves. Now get out there and make your own legend, whatever that means for you.